I'm freezing, let me in, I beg. I'll reward you. In the dead of a Wyoming winter, a rancher hears desperate pounding on his door. Outside, snow swirling in the black night, stands a young, pregnant woman, shivering so hard she can barely speak. She pleads to be let in, and promises a reward that could change his life. But when he finds out what that reward really is, a land deed caught in a dangerous dispute, his quiet ranch becomes the center of a storm fiercer than the blizzard outside. A powerful man is riding hard from Cheyenne to claim both her and her unborn child as his own. In a land where the law can be bought, mercy is a gamble, and winter shows no mercy. One choice will decide if she finds safety or loses everything. Will the truth save them or destroy them both? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The wind howled across the Wyoming plains, a fierce December storm lashing the land with icy fury. Inside his bunkhouse, Caleb Merritt sat alone, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. The day's work tending cattle in the biting cold had left him bone-weary, but the rancher found no rest in the howling gale outside. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Caleb's eyes drifted to the empty chair across from him, a familiar ache tightening his chest. 2 winters had passed since his Shoshone wife had gone to sleep in the earth, yet her absence still cut as sharp as the wind. A sudden pounding at the door jolted Caleb from his brooding. He set down his cup, brow furrowed. Who in tarnation would be out on a night like this? The knocking came again, more urgent this time. Caleb crossed the room in 3 long strides, unlatching the door. A gust of wind and snow nearly knocked him back as he pulled it open. There, silhouetted against the swirling white, stood a young woman. She was wrapped in nothing but a thin shawl, her form heavy with child. "I'm freezing," she gasped through chattering teeth, her eyes wide with desperation. "Let me in, I beg. I'll reward you." For a heartbeat, Caleb hesitated. A stranger at his door in the dead of night spelled trouble, plain as day. But as he took in her trembling form and the fear in her eyes, his caution gave way to compassion. "Come on in, miss," he said gruffly, stepping aside. "Let's get you warmed up." The woman stumbled across the threshold, nearly collapsing into Caleb's arms. He caught her gently, feeling how the cold had seeped into her very bones. Without a word, he guided her to the chair by the pot-bellied stove. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind's howl. "I thought I was done for out there." Caleb grunted in response, already moving to stoke the fire. He added another log, coaxing the flames higher. The woman held her hands out to the growing warmth, her fingers red and swollen from the cold. "Name's Caleb Merritt," he said, straightening up. "What brings you out on a night like this, miss?" "Clara Bell," she replied, her teeth still chattering. "Clara Bell Hodge." Caleb nodded, studying her more closely now. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with a kind face that spoke of both hardship and determination. Her clothes, though travel-worn, hinted at better days gone by. "You mentioned a reward," Caleb said carefully, not wanting to embarrass her. "I hope you know I don't expect nothing for basic human kindness." Clara Bell's eyes met his, a flicker of something, relief, gratitude, passing across her face. "It's not money," she began, but a wave of dizziness seemed to overtake her. She swayed in the chair, her face going pale. "Whoa there," Caleb said, moving quickly to steady her. "Let's get you lying down. You can explain everything once you're settled." He helped Clara Bell to her feet, supporting her as they made their way to his narrow bed in the corner. She sank onto it gratefully, her eyes already fluttering closed. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I'm just so tired." "Rest now," Caleb said, his voice gentler than before. "We'll sort things out come morning." Clara Bell nodded weakly, then seemed to drift off almost immediately. Caleb stood there for a moment, watching the rise and fall of her chest. Then he shook himself and moved to the small stove, setting a kettle of water to boil. No telling when she'd wake, but hot tea would do her good when she did. With the kettle on, Caleb returned to the door. He opened it a crack, peering out into the raging storm. The wind whipped snow into his face, and he could barely see past the porch. Whatever had driven Clara Belle to his door on such a night, it must have been dire indeed. Caleb closed the door firmly, latching it against the howling gale. He turned back to the room, his eyes settling on the sleeping woman. What kind of trouble had just found its way to his door? The rancher sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. There'd be no answers tonight, that was certain. He'd have to wait for morning and hope Clara Belle's story wasn't as worrisome as he feared. Caleb settled into the chair by the fire, resigning himself to a long night's vigil. As the storm raged outside, he found his thoughts drifting to the past. To another night, years ago, when a lost soul had sought shelter at his door. His wife, then a stranger fleeing from those who would harm her people. He'd taken her in then, never imagining how she'd change his life. Now, here he was again, opening his door to someone in need. Caleb couldn't help but wonder if this too would be a turning point. The kettle began to whistle softly, pulling Caleb from his musings. He rose to take it off the heat, stealing another glance at Clara Belle. She slept on, oblivious to his scrutiny, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. Caleb's jaw tightened. Pregnant and alone in a blizzard, no woman should find herself in such a state. Whatever her story, he'd do what he could to help. It's what his wife would have wanted. He was sure of that. As the night wore on, Caleb kept watch. He tended the fire, brewed fresh coffee, and listened to the storm's fury gradually subside. All the while, his mind turned over the questions raised by Clara Belle's arrival. What had driven her out into such weather? Who was the father of her child? And what was this mysterious reward she'd mentioned? Caleb knew better than to jump to conclusions. Life on the frontier had taught him that things were rarely as simple as they first appeared. He'd wait to hear Clara Belle's tale before passing judgment. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the frosted windows, Caleb rose to check on his unexpected guest. Clara Belle stirred slightly at his approach but didn't wake. Some color had returned to her cheeks and her breathing was deep and even. Caleb nodded to himself, satisfied she was out of immediate danger. He'd let her sleep a while longer before rousing her for some hot food and drink. Lord knew she needed the rest. With a sigh, he turned back to the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow blanketed the land as far as the eye could see, glittering in the pale morning light. It was beautiful, in its way. But Caleb knew the work that lay ahead. His cattle would need tending, fences would need mending, and now he had a pregnant woman to look after. But as he gazed out at the pristine landscape, Caleb felt a stirring of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope, maybe. Or the sense that, just perhaps, this unexpected arrival might be the start of something new. He shook his head, chuckling softly at his own fanciful thoughts. There'd be time enough for wondering later. For now, there was work to be done. Caleb moved to the stove, stoking the fire and setting about making a hearty breakfast. Whatever the day might bring, they'd face it better with full bellies. As he worked, he found himself humming softly, an old Shoshone song his wife had taught him, about new beginnings after long winters. Outside, the sun rose higher, setting the snow-covered plains aglow. Inside the bunkhouse, Caleb Merritt prepared to face whatever challenges the new day might bring, his heart a little lighter than it had been the night before. As the first light of dawn crept through the frosted windows, Clara Belle stirred from her deep slumber. The howling wind had ceased, replaced by an eerie stillness that only comes after a heavy snowfall. She blinked, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night came rushing back, the desperate trek through the blizzard, the pounding on a stranger's door, and the gruff but kind man who had taken her in. Clara Belle pushed herself up, wincing at the ache in her muscles. The warmth of the bunkhouse enveloped her, a stark contrast to the biting cold she'd endured. As she gathered her bearings, the scent of something cooking wafted through the air, making her stomach growl in response. "Good morning," a deep voice rumbled from across the room. Clara Bell turned to see Caleb standing by the pot-bellied stove, stirring a pot of what appeared to be oatmeal. "Thought you might be hungry when you woke." "Thank you," Clara Bell said, her voice still rough from sleep. "I can't tell you how grateful I am for your kindness, Mr. Merritt." Caleb grunted in acknowledgement, ladling the steaming oatmeal into 2 tin bowls. He brought one over to Clara Bell, along with a mug of hot coffee. "Reckon you've got quite a story to tell," he said, settling into a chair nearby with his own breakfast. Clara Bell cupped the warm mug in her hand, savoring the heat before taking a sip. The rich, bitter taste was a comfort she hadn't realized she'd been craving. "I do," she agreed, meeting Caleb's steady gaze. "And I owe you an explanation about the reward I mentioned last night." Caleb raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Clara Bell set down her coffee and reached for the worn satchel she'd carried with her. From it, she withdrew a folded piece of paper, creased and yellowed with age. "This is what I meant by a reward," she said, holding it out to Caleb. "It's a deed to 40 acres along the river. Prime land for grazing, I'm told." Caleb's eyes widened slightly as he took the paper, unfolding it carefully. His weathered hands smoothed out the creases as he studied the document, his brow furrowing in concentration. "I'm offering it to you," Clara Bell continued, her voice soft but determined, "in exchange for letting me stay here until I can give birth." Her hand unconsciously moved to rest on her swollen belly. Caleb looked up from the deed, his expression a mix of intrigue and skepticism. "This land," he said slowly, "I know where it is. It's territory I've been disputing with the Wind River Agency for years now. Water rights have been a constant battle." He paused, studying Clara Bell's face. "How did you come by this?" Clara Bell took a deep breath, steeling herself for the story she knew she had to share. "It was given to me by a cavalry officer," she began. "I was working in a small hotel in Cheyenne when he was brought in, sick with pneumonia. The local doctor was overwhelmed with other patients, so I volunteered to nurse him." She paused, taking another sip of coffee before continuing. "For days I sat by his bedside doing what I could to ease his suffering. He was delirious most of the time, muttering about battles and land disputes. When he finally came to his senses, he knew he was dying." The fire in the stove popped loudly, making Clara Bell jump slightly. Caleb remained silent, his eyes never leaving her face. "He told me he had no family left," she went on. "Said he wanted to do one good thing before he passed. He gave me this deed, saying it was payment for my kindness. I didn't know what to do with it at the time. I was just trying to survive day to day." Caleb nodded slowly, looking back down at the deed in his hands. "And now?" he asked. "Why offer it to me?" Clara Bell's hand tightened on her mug. "Because I need a safe place, Mr. Merritt. I need somewhere I can bring this child into the world without fear. And I have nothing else to offer in return for your help." A heavy silence fell over the bunkhouse as Caleb considered her words. Clara Bell held her breath, watching his face for any sign of what he might be thinking. After what felt like an eternity, he carefully folded the deed and handed it back to her. "I can't take this from you," he said gruffly. "Not without knowing for certain it's legitimate. And even then—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "But I won't turn you out either. Not in your condition, and not with winter setting in hard." Relief washed over Clara Bell, bringing tears to her eyes that she quickly blinked away. "Thank you," she whispered. "I promise I won't be a burden. I can cook and sew and help around the ranch however you need." Caleb stood, gathering their empty bowls. "We'll sort all that out later," he said. "For now you need rest. I've got a seat of the cattle. Make sure they weathered the storm all right." He moved to the door, pulling on his heavy coat and boots. Before stepping out into the snow-covered world, he turned back to Clara Bell. "I'll be back before sundown. Make yourself at home, but don't overdo it. There's more oatmeal in the pot if you get hungry again." With that, he was gone, leaving Clara Bell alone in the warmth of the bunkhouse. She sat there for a long moment, overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger who had taken her in. Eventually, she rose and began to tidy up, determined to show her gratitude in whatever small ways she could. The day passed slowly, with Clarabelle alternating between rest and light chores. She swept the floor, organized Caleb's meager collection of dishes, and even darned a pair of socks she found with holes in the toes. All the while her mind raced with thoughts of what might come next. Would Caleb truly let her stay? Could she find a way to make a life here for herself and her unborn child? As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, Clarabelle heard the crunch of boots approaching. Caleb stomped the snow from his feet before entering, his cheeks red from the cold. "Cattle made it through all right," he reported, hanging up his coat. "But there's a lot of work to be done, mending fences and clearing paths." Clarabelle nodded, unsure of what to say. Caleb looked around the bunkhouse, noting the small changes she'd made during the day. His expression softened slightly. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "There's a spare room off the back of the bunkhouse. It ain't much, but it'll give you some privacy. I can set up a pallet in there for you tonight." Clarabelle's heart swelled with gratitude. "That would be wonderful," she said softly. "Thank you, Mr. Merritt. I can't tell you how much this means to me." Caleb waved off her thanks, already moving to prepare the room. As Clarabelle watched him work, she felt a glimmer of hope spark in her chest. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things might turn out all right. That evening, as Clarabelle settled onto her pallet in the small but clean spare room, she whispered a prayer of thanks. Outside, the stars twinkled brightly in the clear, cold sky, a silent witness to the unexpected turn her life had taken. In the main room of the bunkhouse, Caleb sat by the fire. 2 days passed in a peaceful rhythm at Caleb Merritt's ranch. The winter wind whistled outside, but inside the bunkhouse, Clarabelle found a sense of safety she hadn't known in months. She spent her time resting as Caleb had instructed, but also found small ways to make herself useful. On the morning of the third day, Caleb rose early as usual. Clarabelle heard him moving about in the main room, the floorboards creaking under his boots. She pulled herself from her warm pallet and peeked out of the spare room. "Mornin'," Caleb nodded, adjusting his hat. "I'm heading out to check the cattle pens, then riding into town for supplies. You stay here and rest, you hear?" Clarabelle nodded, grateful for his concern. "I will, Mr. Merritt. Thank you." As Caleb's horse's hoofbeats faded into the distance, Clarabelle set about her day. She tidied the bunkhouse, sweeping away the ever-present dust that seemed to seep in through every crack. Her eyes fell on a torn curtain hanging crookedly in the window. With a small smile, she retrieved her sewing kit from her satchel and set to work mending the fabric. The quiet hours passed as Clarabelle kept her hands busy. She hummed softly to herself, old hymns her mother had taught her long ago. As the afternoon wore on, she decided to prepare a simple stew for supper. The familiar motions of chopping vegetables and stirring the pot brought her a sense of purpose. Just as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, Clarabelle heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. She peered out the window, expecting to see Caleb returning. Instead, her heart leapt into her throat at the sight of 3 men on horseback. Before she could decide what to do, a firm knock sounded at the door. Clarabelle hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the latch. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. "Evening, ma'am," said the man in front, his weathered face set in a grim expression. A silver star gleamed on his chest, the local sheriff. "I'm Sheriff Thomas Lomax. These are Mr. Johnson and Mr. Peterson from town. We're looking for Caleb Merritt." Clarabelle swallowed hard. "Mr. Merritt isn't here right now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He rode into town for supplies. Is there something wrong?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. "And who might you be, ma'am?" Before Clarabelle could answer, one of the other men, Johnson, spoke up. "That's her, Sheriff. That's the woman from the telegram." Clarabelle's blood ran cold. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. Sheriff Lomax held up a hand, silencing Johnson. "Ma'am, we received word from Cheyenne about a runaway mail-order bride. The description matches you pretty close. Now, there's no warrant yet, but I reckon a telegram could come any day now." Clarabelle's hands began to shake. "No, you don't understand," she pleaded. There was no marriage. I never— Johnson scoffed loudly. That's not what your husband says, Missy. Says you took off with his money and his good name. Tears welled up in Clara Belle's eyes. That's not true, she insisted. He lied to me. I never agreed to marry him. Please, you have to believe me. The men exchanged skeptical glances. Sheriff Lomax opened his mouth to speak again when the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the tense silence. Caleb Merritt rode up, his brow furrowing at the sight of the unexpected visitors. He dismounted quickly, moving to stand beside Clara Belle. What's going on here? He asked, his voice low and steady. Sheriff Lomax tipped his hat. Evening, Caleb. We've got ourselves a situation here. This young lady is wanted in Cheyenne. Seems she's run out on her husband. Caleb's eyes flicked to Clara Belle, who was trembling beside him. He saw the fear in her eyes, the silent plea for help. Something stirred in his chest, a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years, not since. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the present. That's so, he said calmly. And what proof do you have of this, Thomas? The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Well, like I said, there's no official warrant yet, but we got a telegram describing her and— A telegram? Caleb interrupted. That's hardly enough to go dragging a woman away from safety in the dead of winter now, is it? Clara Belle's eyes widened at Caleb's words. She hadn't dared hope he would stand up for her like this. Sheriff Lomax frowned. Now, Caleb, you know I've got a duty to uphold the law. If there's a husband looking for his wife— He's not my husband, Clara Belle burst out, her voice stronger now. I never married him. He tricked me, said he needed help running his store, offered me a job. But when I got there— She trailed off, shuddering at the memory. Caleb's jaw tightened. He placed a gentle hand on Clara Belle's shoulder, steadying her. Sounds to me like there's more to this story than a simple runaway bride, Thomas. The sheriff hesitated, clearly torn between his duty and the scene unfolding before him. Finally, he sighed. All right, Caleb. I can't do anything without an official warrant anyway. But if one comes— If it comes, we'll deal with it then, Caleb said firmly. For now, I think it's best you gentlemen head on back to town. It's getting dark and these roads ain't safe at night. The other two men grumbled, but Sheriff Lomax nodded. Fair enough. We'll be in touch, Caleb. Ma'am. He tipped his hat once more before turning his horse around. As the three men rode away, Clara Belle sagged against the doorframe, her legs weak with relief. Caleb guided her gently back inside the bunkhouse, closing the door against the chill wind. Thank you, Clara Belle whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I didn't know what I was going to do. Caleb's face softened as he looked at her. No need for thanks. I meant what I said. I won't let them drag you away without the truth coming out. Whatever that truth might be. Clara Belle nodded, wiping away a stray tear. I swear to you, Mr. Merritt, I've done nothing wrong. That man in Cheyenne, he lied to me. When I realized what he really wanted, I ran. I couldn't let him. She trailed off, unable to finish. Caleb's eyes flashed with anger, but his voice remained gentle. You're safe here, Clara Belle. I promise you that. We'll figure this out. Together. As Clara Belle looked up at him, she felt a glimmer of hope bloom in her chest. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she had found an ally in this quiet, steadfast rancher. The bunkhouse fell silent as they both processed the events of the evening. Outside, the wind howled across the Wyoming plains, but inside, a fragile sense of peace settled over them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now they had weathered this storm together. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the sun glinting off the fresh snow that blanketed the Wyoming landscape. Caleb Merritt rose early, his mind already churning with plans as he stepped out into the biting cold. He made his way to the barn, his boots crunching through the snow-covered yard. Inside, he began hitching up his wagon, the familiar motions bringing a sense of purpose to his troubled thoughts. The horses nickered softly as he worked, their breath visible in the frosty air. Caleb patted their flanks, murmuring words of encouragement as he finished securing the harnesses. Back in the bunkhouse, Clara Bell was already awake, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her shawl. When Caleb explained his plan to take her to his sister Martha's ranch house, relief washed over her face. "You think it'll be safer there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb nodded, his expression grave. "The sheriff's likely to keep an eye on this place. Martha's home is further out, and she's good at keeping secrets when need be." As they set out, the wagon creaking beneath them, Clara Bell huddled close to Caleb for warmth. The vast, snow-covered plains stretched out before them, broken only by the occasional cluster of bare trees or distant hillock. The journey was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts as the horses plodded steadily onward. After what felt like hours, a modest ranch house came into view. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and as they drew closer, Clara Bell could make out a figure standing on the porch, shading her eyes against the winter sun. Martha Merritt was a woman in her early 40s with streaks of gray in her dark hair and laugh lines etched around her eyes. As Caleb helped Clara Bell down from the wagon, Martha hurried forward, her face a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Caleb, I wasn't expecting you today," she said, her gaze flickering between her brother and the young woman beside him. "And who might this be?" Caleb cleared his throat. "Martha, this is Clara Bell Hodge. She needs a safe place to stay for a while. I was hoping you might be able to help." Martha's eyes softened as she took in Clara Bell's obvious pregnancy and nervous demeanor. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and took the younger woman's hands in her own. "Of course. You're welcome here, Clara Bell. Come on inside where it's warm." The kitchen was indeed a haven of warmth and comfort. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, and the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air. Clara Bell felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as Martha bustled about, pouring hot tea and setting out plates of cookies. As they settled around the kitchen table, Martha's keen eyes took in every detail. She listened intently as Caleb explained the situation in hushed tones, her brow furrowing with concern. When he finished, Martha turned to Clara Bell. "You poor dear," she said softly. "You must have been so frightened. Well, you're safe here. I promise you that." Clara Bell felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the kindness of these near strangers. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how I can ever repay you both." Martha waved away her words. "Nonsense, we look after our own out here. Now how about you help me with supper? I find keeping busy is the best cure for worry." Grateful for the distraction, Clara Bell eagerly agreed. Soon the two women were working side by side, chopping vegetables for a hearty stew. As they worked, Martha gently probed for more information, her questions casual but pointed. "So, Clara Bell, where are you from originally?" she asked, her knife rhythmically slicing through a carrot. Clara Bell hesitated only a moment before answering. "Ohio originally, but I've been moving around these past few years, looking for work." Martha nodded sympathetically. "And what brought you out to Cheyenne?" Clara Bell's hand stilled for a moment, her eyes fixed on the potato she was peeling. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "There was a man there. He offered me a job in his store, said he needed help running it." Martha's keen gaze caught the shadow that passed over Clara Bell's face. "But it wasn't what you expected?" Clara Bell shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. He wanted to control me, to own me, really. When I realized what he truly intended, I knew I had to leave." Martha reached out and squeezed Clara Bell's hand gently. "You did the right thing, dear. No one has the right to take away your freedom." As the women worked in the kitchen, Caleb retreated to the parlor. He sank into an armchair by the window, his mind turning over the events of the past few days. The land deed Clara Bell had offered weighed heavily on his thoughts. Such a valuable piece of property. It could solve so many problems for his struggling ranch. But the circumstances surrounding it were troubling. He found himself considering whether to take the deed to Reverend Parsons for advice. The old preacher was known for his wisdom and discretion. If anyone could shed light on the legal and moral implications of the situation, it would be him. As the evening wore on, the aroma of simmering stew filled the house. When Martha called them to the table, Caleb was surprised to see how comfortable Clarabelle seemed, chatting easily with his sister as they set out bowls and spoons. Over supper, Martha continued her gentle questioning, piecing together Clarabelle's story bit by bit. Clarabelle's answers remained careful, revealing only the barest details of her time in Cheyenne and the man she had fled from. But with each passing moment, Caleb found himself more convinced of her sincerity. As they finished their meal, Martha fixed Caleb with a serious look. "A word, brother," she said, nodding towards the parlor. Once they were alone, Martha spoke in low, urgent tones. "Caleb, you need to tread carefully here. Land disputes like this, they can turn ugly fast, especially in winter when folks are desperate." Caleb nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I know, Martha. I've been thinking of taking the deed to Reverend Parsons. See what he makes of it." Martha considered this for a moment before nodding slowly. "That might be wise. But whatever you do, be cautious. That poor girl's been through enough already." As they prepared for bed that night, Caleb found himself standing by the window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. The events of the past few days had stirred something in him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, not since losing his wife. He knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but looking back at Clarabelle, peacefully asleep on the spare bed, he felt resolved to see it through. Tomorrow, he decided he would ride into town and seek the Reverend's counsel. Whatever came next, he was determined to protect Clarabelle and uncover the truth behind her mysterious land deed. With that decision made, he finally allowed himself to settle into sleep, the quiet of the Wyoming night enveloping the ranch house in a blanket of peace. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the pale winter sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Caleb and Clarabelle set out early, the wagon creaking beneath them as they made their way into town. Clarabelle huddled close to Caleb, her shawl pulled tight against the biting wind. As they rode, Caleb couldn't help but steal glances at the young woman beside him. Her face was set with determination, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. He marveled at her strength, wondering what trials she had endured to bring her to this point. The town came into view, a cluster of wooden buildings rising from the stark white plains. People bustled about their morning routines, nodding greetings as Caleb guided the wagon down the main street. He pulled up in front of a modest white chapel, its steeple reaching towards the clear blue sky. "This is Reverend Parsons' church," Caleb explained, helping Clarabelle down from the wagon. "If anyone can help us make sense of your deed, it's him." They found the Reverend in his study, a small room off the side of the chapel filled with books and the scent of pipe tobacco. Silas Parsons was a man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a neatly trimmed gray beard. He greeted them warmly, ushering them into chairs before his desk. "Now then," he said, settling into his own seat, "what brings you two to see me on this fine morning?" Caleb glanced at Clarabelle, who nodded slightly. He reached into his coat and produced the folded deed, placing it on the Reverend's desk. "We need your advice about this, Reverend. It's a land deed that Clarabelle here was given, but we're not sure of its status." Reverend Parsons leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles as he carefully unfolded the worn paper. His brow furrowed as he studied the document, his fingers tracing the faded ink. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. After what felt like an eternity, the Reverend looked up, his expression grave. "Well," he began, "I can tell you this much. The officer's signature here matches one I have in the church registry. Captain James Hollister, if I'm not mistaken." Clarabelle's eyes widened. Yes, that was his name. He died of pneumonia. I nursed him in his last days. The Reverend nodded slowly. "I remember hearing about his passing. A good man, by all accounts." He paused, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "However, there's a problem. This deed, it was never filed at the land office." Caleb felt his heart sink. "What does that mean exactly?" Reverend Parsons sighed, removing his spectacles and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "It means that while this deed appears to be genuine in origin, it's legally vulnerable. Without proper filing, Anyone could challenge its validity. Clarabelle's face paled, her hands clutching at her shawl. But he gave it to me. It was his dying wish. The Reverend's eyes softened with sympathy. I believe you, my dear. Perhaps you could tell us exactly how this came about. Clarabelle took a deep breath, her gaze distant as she recalled that fateful night. It was so cold, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I'd been working at a small boarding house on the outskirts of town when they brought him in. He was burning with fever, delirious. She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. For days I tended to him, changing compresses, spooning broth into his mouth when he was lucid enough to swallow. On the last night, he seemed to rally a bit. His eyes cleared and he looked right at me. Clarabelle's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if drawing strength from the memory. He asked my name, and when I told him, he smiled. Clarabelle, he said, you've shown me more kindness than I deserve. Then he pressed this paper into my hands. He told me it was 40 acres of good land, that it would give me a fresh start. She looked up at the Reverend, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He died not long after that. I didn't know what to do. I just kept the paper, thinking maybe someday. Reverend Parsons nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. It's a touching story, and I've no doubt of its truth. But the fact remains, without proper filing, this deed is in a precarious position. Caleb leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Is there anything we can do? Any way to make it official now? The Reverend stroked his beard, considering. It's possible, but it won't be easy. You'd need to prove the captain's intent, perhaps find witnesses to corroborate Clarabelle's story, and even then, there might be challenges. That land, well, it's valuable. There are those who might contest such a claim, especially given the unusual circumstances. As they left the church, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the sting of approaching snow. Caleb helped Clarabelle back into the wagon, his mind whirling with all they had learned. The ride back was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts as the first flakes began to fall. By the time they reached the ranch, the snow was coming down in earnest. Caleb hurried to get the horses settled in the barn, while Clarabelle made her way inside to start a fire. As he worked, Caleb found himself dwelling on the Reverend's words. The land described in the deed. It was prime grazing territory, with access to water that could make all the difference for his struggling ranch. But at what cost? The danger to Clarabelle if someone chose to dispute the claim, it didn't bear thinking about, and yet he couldn't help but consider the possibilities. With those water rights secured, he could expand his herd, maybe even hire on some help. It could be the fresh start he'd been hoping for since losing his wife. As evening settled in, Caleb found himself in the barn, methodically sharpening tools by lantern light. The repetitive motion was soothing, allowing his mind to turn over the day's events. The scrape of metal on whetstone filled the air, punctuated by the occasional whinny from the horses or the distant howl of wind. He thought of Clarabelle, of the strength and determination he'd seen in her eyes as she recounted her story. She deserved a chance at a new life, free from whatever shadows haunted her past. But was he willing to risk her safety for the promise of water rights? The lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows on the barn walls. Caleb set aside the newly sharpened axe, reaching for a dull saw blade. As he worked, he found his resolve hardening. Whatever came next, he knew he couldn't abandon Clarabelle to face it alone. They would find a way to secure her claim, to give her the fresh start she so desperately needed. With a final stroke of the whetstone, Caleb set his tools aside. The snow was still falling outside, blanketing the world in pristine white. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now there was warmth and safety within these walls. As he made his way back to the house, Caleb felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. Whatever storms lay ahead, they would weather them together. The days following their visit to Reverend Parsons settled into a gentle rhythm at Martha's ranch house. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the Wyoming landscape in a hushed white. But inside, Warmth and activity thrived. Clara Belle, despite her growing belly, insisted on helping with the daily chores. Each morning she'd join Martha in the kitchen, kneading dough for fresh bread or stirring a pot of hearty stew. The two women worked side by side, their hands busy as they shared stories and laughter. "You're a natural in the kitchen," Martha remarked one day, watching Clara Belle expertly roll out pie crust. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" Clara Belle's cheeks pinked at the compliment. "Oh, I picked up bits and pieces here and there, mostly working in boarding houses and such." Martha nodded, her eyes kind. "Well, you've certainly got a knack for it. It's nice having another pair of hands around the place." As the week progressed, Clara Belle found herself settling into the household's routines. On laundry day, she stood beside Martha at the washtub, scrubbing Caleb's work shirts with vigor. The repetitive motion was soothing, and soon Clara Belle found herself humming softly. Martha cocked her head, listening. "Is that amazing, Grace?" Clara Belle nodded a bit shyly. "It was my mama's favorite. She used to sing it while she worked." "It's lovely," Martha said. "Why don't you sing it proper? I'd be happy to join in." And so, as steam rose from the washtub and the winter wind whistled outside, their voices blended in harmony, filling the kitchen with the old, familiar hymn. Later that afternoon, Clara Belle sat by the fire, mending one of Caleb's shirts. The needle flashed in and out of the fabric as she worked, her voice lifting in another quiet hymn. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't notice Martha's young niece, Sarah, watching her with wide eyes. "That's awful pretty," the little girl said, startling Clara Belle. Clara Belle smiled warmly. "Thank you, sweetheart. Would you like to learn it?" Sarah nodded eagerly, and soon the two were singing together, their voices mingling with the crackle of the fire. When Martha came in from the barn, she found them giggling over a clumsy attempt at harmonizing. As the days passed, Caleb found himself spending more and more time at Martha's. He'd come in from tending to the cattle, stamping snow from his boots, to find Clara Belle setting the table, or helping Sarah with her letters. Each time, the sight made something warm unfurl in his chest. In the evenings, after supper was cleared away, Caleb would settle himself in a corner of the sitting room. There, with his pocket knife and a piece of pine, he'd begun to work on a small project. His hands, rough from years of ranch work, moved with surprising delicacy as he carved and smoothed the wood. "What are you making, brother?" Martha asked one night, peering over his shoulder. Caleb's ears reddened slightly. "Just a cradle," he mumbled. "Figured it might come in handy is all." Martha's eyes twinkled, but she said nothing, simply patting his shoulder as she moved away. As the fire burned low one evening, Martha couldn't help but notice the change in her brother. His face, so often stern and drawn since the loss of his wife, had softened. There was a light in his eyes that she hadn't seen in years. "You know, Caleb," she said, her tone teasing, "I do believe you're smiling more these days." Caleb ducked his head, suddenly very interested in the wood shavings at his feet. Across the room, Clara Belle looked down at her mending, her cheeks flushing a pretty pink. The peaceful routine continued, days blending into one another as the snow piled higher outside. Clara Belle found herself feeling more at home than she had in years, surrounded by the warmth of Martha's care and Caleb's quiet strength. But like all moments of peace, this one couldn't last forever. It was Caleb who brought the news, stomping into the kitchen one afternoon with a grim set to his jaw. "Heard something in town today," he said, his voice low. "That fella from Cheyenne. He's been seen boarding the northbound train." The words fell like stones into the cozy kitchen. Clara Belle's face went pale, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. Martha reached out, squeezing the younger woman's shoulder. Now, she said, her voice steady. "No need to panic, we don't know for certain he's coming here." Caleb nodded, but his eyes were troubled. "True enough, but we'd best be prepared, just in case." As night fell, bringing with it another flurry of snow, the mood in the house had shifted. The threat they'd all tried to forget loomed large once more, casting shadows even in the warmth of the firelit room. Clara Belle sat by the window, her fingers worrying at the hem of her shawl as she stared out into the darkness. The peace she'd found here felt suddenly fragile, like a soap bubble ready to burst at the slightest touch. Caleb watched her from across the room, his heart heavy. The cradle sat unfinished in his lap, a reminder of hopes he'd barely allowed himself to acknowledge. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let Clara Belle face it alone. The first Sunday of the new year dawned crisp and clear, the morning sun glinting off the snow-covered plains. Inside Martha's cozy farmhouse, the air buzzed with anticipation for the day ahead. "Clara Belle," Martha called, her voice warm and encouraging. "Won't you join us for the service today? It'd do you good to get out, and the congregation would love to meet you properly." Clara Belle hesitated, her hands smoothing nervously over her rounded belly. "I don't know, Martha. What if someone asks questions I can't answer?" Martha's eyes crinkled with understanding. "Now, don't you fret. These are good folks. They'll just be glad to see a new face." After a moment's consideration, Clara Belle nodded. "All right," she said softly. "I reckon it might be nice to hear a proper sermon again." As they prepared to leave, Caleb appeared in the doorway, looking a touch uncomfortable in his Sunday best. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Clara Belle, her hair neatly pinned and wearing one of Martha's old dresses, carefully altered to accommodate her condition. "You look," he began, then cleared his throat. "That is, are you sure you're up for the outing?" Clara Belle offered him a small smile. "I think so. It'll be good to stretch my legs a bit." The little church stood proud against the winter sky, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the sunlight. As they approached, the sound of cheerful greetings filled the air. Clara Belle felt a flutter of nervousness in her chest, but Martha's steady presence beside her gave her courage. Inside, the pews were filled with families dressed in their Sunday finest. Curious glances and welcoming smiles greeted them as they made their way to a seat. Clara Belle kept her eyes lowered, acutely aware of the whispers that followed in their wake. As the service began, she found herself swept up in the familiar rhythms of worship. The old hymns brought a lump to her throat, reminding her of simpler times. When the Reverend spoke of hope and new beginnings, she felt a spark of something she hadn't dared feel in months: possibility. After the service, the congregation gathered in the church hall for a New Year's celebration. The room hummed with conversation and laughter as people shared plates of home-cooked food and caught up on local news. Clara Belle stood to the side, feeling a bit out of place, when Mrs. Peterson, the Reverend's wife, approached her with a warm smile. "My dear, I hear you have quite the singing voice. Would you grace us with a hymn?" Clara Belle's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, I don't know if I should—" "Please," Mrs. Peterson urged gently. "It would be such a treat for everyone." After a moment's hesitation, Clara Belle nodded. "All right," she said softly. "I suppose I could sing one." As she made her way to the front of the room, a hush fell over the gathering. Clara Belle took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to sing. "Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee." Her voice, clear and sweet, filled the hall. The familiar words of the hymn seemed to take on new meaning as she sang, her hand resting lightly on her belly. As the final notes faded away, Clara Belle opened her eyes to find many in the congregation dabbing at tears. Caleb, standing at the back of the room, felt something shift inside him. He'd known Clara Belle was kind and hard-working, but this was something else entirely. The way her voice had soared, full of emotion and faith despite all she'd been through, stirred something in him he thought had died along with his wife. The ride home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. As evening settled in, Caleb found Clara Belle in the kitchen, preparing a pot of tea. The lamplight cast a warm glow over her features, softening the worry lines that often creased her brow. "That was quite something today," Caleb said, his voice low. "Your singing, I mean." Clara Belle looked up, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Thank you," she murmured. It felt good to sing like that again. Almost like I belonged somewhere, even if just for a moment. Caleb's heart twisted at the longing in her voice. "You do belong," he said, surprising himself with the intensity of his words. "Here, I mean, with us." Clara Belle's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I've prayed for that," she admitted softly. For a place to call home, for people who might care for me, for the baby. Caleb found himself moving closer, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Clara Bell, But before he could finish his thought, the sound of galloping hooves broke the stillness of the night. They exchanged a worried glance before hurrying to the window. Outside, a rider was dismounting, his breath clouding in the cold air. Even in the dim light, they could make out the glint of a badge on his chest, one of Sheriff Lomax's deputies. "Telegram for the sheriff," the man called out, his voice carrying in the quiet night. "Urgent business from Cheyenne." As the deputy rode off, Caleb and Clara Bell stood frozen, the warmth of their earlier moment shattered by the cold reality of what might be coming. "It'll be all right," Caleb said, his voice gruff with emotion he wasn't used to feeling. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Clara Bell nodded, her hand finding his in the darkness, and for a moment, despite the uncertainty that loomed before them, they both felt the stirring of something that felt a lot like hope. The crisp morning air nipped at Martha's cheeks as she hurried along the snow-dusted boardwalk towards the Mercantile. Her breath puffed out in small clouds, matching the quick pace of her steps. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, the familiar jingle of the bell announced her arrival. "Morning, Mrs. Merritt," old Mr. Harding called from behind the counter, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "What can I do for you today?" Martha smiled back, but her eyes were sharp as she scanned the store. A small cluster of women huddled near the fabric bolts, their heads bent close in hushed conversation. Martha's ears pricked up as she caught snatches of their whispered words. "Telegram from Cheyenne. That poor girl. Claims them as his property." Martha's heart sank. She'd feared this might happen, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter air. Forcing her face into a neutral expression, she approached the counter. "Just some sugar and coffee today, Mr. Harding," she said, her voice steady despite the worry gnawing at her insides. As the shopkeeper bustled about, weighing out her purchases, Martha strained to hear more. The women's voices had dropped even lower, but one phrase rang out clear as a bell. "Sheriff Lomax says his hands are tied if the man's got papers." Martha's fingers tightened on the edge of the counter. Papers. Of course. The law had a way of twisting itself to benefit those who knew how to use it. She thought of Clara Bell, of the fear that sometimes flickered in the young woman's eyes when she thought no one was looking. "That'll be 85 cents, Mrs. Merritt." Mr. Harding's voice broke through her thoughts. Martha paid and gathered her parcels, her mind already racing ahead to what needed to be done. As she stepped back out into the biting cold, she squared her shoulders. They'd weathered storms before, both natural and man-made. They'd weather this one, too. Back at the ranch, Martha found Caleb in the barn, methodically checking the livestock's winter supplies. The set of his jaw told her he already knew. "You heard, then?" she asked, setting down her packages. Caleb nodded, his eyes hard. "Overheard some men talking outside the smithy. Property." He spat the word like it left a foul taste in his mouth. As if a woman and her unborn child were no more than a piece of land or a head of cattle. Martha laid a gentle hand on her brother's arm. "We won't let it come to that," she said firmly. "Clara Bell's one of us now. We protect our own." A flicker of something, determination perhaps, or something deeper, passed across Caleb's face. He nodded once, sharply. "I'm riding into town this afternoon. Need to hear from Lomax himself what we're up against." As if summoned by their conversation, Clara Bell appeared in the barn doorway, her shawl pulled tight against the wind that howled outside. Her face was pale, but her chin was set in a determined line. "I heard you talking," she said softly. Is it him? Has he come for me?" Martha moved swiftly to the young woman's side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Not yet, dear, but it seems he's sent word ahead." Clara Bell's hand moved instinctively to her swollen belly as if to shield the life growing there. "What are we going to do?" Caleb stepped forward, his voice gruff but gentle. "We're going to fight, that's what. I won't let anyone take you against your will, papers or no papers." A ghost of a smile touched Clarabelle's lips, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Both of you. I don't know what I'd do without—" Her words were cut off by a particularly fierce gust of wind that rattled the barn doors. Caleb frowned, peering out at the sky that had grown ominously dark. "Storm's coming," he muttered. "I'd best get to town and back before it hits full force." As Caleb saddled his horse, Martha and Clarabelle worked to secure anything that might blow away in the impending blizzard. The air grew heavy with the promise of snow, and an uneasy silence settled over the ranch. Hours later, as the first white flakes began to swirl through the air, Caleb urged his horse down the main street of town. The usually bustling thoroughfare was nearly deserted, shopkeepers hurrying to close up before the worst of the weather hit. Sheriff Lomax was just locking up the jailhouse when Caleb approached. The older man's face was grim as he turned to face the rancher. "Figured you'd be by," Lomax said, his breath steaming in the cold air. "I reckon you've heard about the telegram." Caleb nodded, his fingers tightening on the reins. "What can you tell me, Tom? What are we dealing with here?" The sheriff sighed, running a hand over his grizzled chin. "It's not good, Caleb. The man in Cheyenne, he's claiming Clarabelle as his lawful wife. Says she ran off with his child and property." "And you believe that?" Caleb's voice was low, dangerous. Lomax held up his hands. "What I believe don't matter much in the eyes of the law. If he shows up with legal papers, my hands are tied. I'd have to at least detain her until things get sorted out." Caleb's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. "She's not some runaway slave, Tom. She's a free woman who made her own choice." "I know that," the sheriff said, his voice softening. "And I'll do what I can to slow things down if it comes to it. But you need to be prepared. This could get ugly fast." As if to punctuate his words, the wind picked up, driving icy pellets of snow against their faces. Caleb looked up at the darkening sky and knew he had to get back. "Thanks for the warning," he said gruffly, turning his horse. "We'll be ready." The ride back to the ranch was treacherous, the newly fallen snow already obscuring the familiar landmarks. Caleb pushed his mount hard, knowing every minute counted. The thought of Clarabelle and Martha alone at the ranch, with both the storm and an unknown threat bearing down on them, spurred him on. As the first true curtain of white descended, blotting out the world beyond his horse's ears, Caleb's mind raced. They had weathered storms before, both of nature and man. But this felt different. The law, which should protect the innocent, was being twisted into a weapon, and caught in the middle was a young woman who had already suffered more than her fair share. Caleb's jaw set with grim determination. Come hell or high water, or in this case, a Wyoming blizzard, he would see Clarabelle and her child safe. The how of it? Well, that was a problem for when he made it back to the ranch. With that thought driving him forward, Caleb leaned low over his horse's neck and pushed on through the swirling white, racing the storm home. The blizzard descended upon the Wyoming ranch with a fury that seemed to swallow the world whole. For 3 long days, the wind howled and snow piled against doors and windows, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien expanse of white. The ranch house, once a haven of warmth and safety, now felt like a fragile island in a sea of swirling snow. Caleb Merritt stood at the frost-covered window, his breath fogging the glass as he peered out at the whiteout conditions. The barn, usually visible from the kitchen, was now nothing more than a hazy outline in the storm. He knew the cattle were sheltered inside, but each trip to tend them had become a test of endurance. "Reckon we're in for the long haul," he muttered, turning back to face Clarabelle, who sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. She nodded, her eyes reflecting a mix of worry and gratitude. "I've never seen a storm like this," she admitted softly. "Back in Cheyenne, the buildings blocked the worst of it." Caleb pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his weathered hands clasping his own mug. "Wyoming winters don't mess around," he said with a wry smile. "But we're stocked up, and the animals are safe. All we can do now is wait it out." As the hours stretched into days, they fell into a quiet routine. Caleb made his trips to the barn, bundled against the biting cold, while Clarabelle tended to the house. They passed the time with simple card games, the shuffling of the deck a comforting sound against the howling wind outside. On the second evening, as they sat by the warmth of the stove, Clara Belle picked up Caleb's work gloves, examining the worn leather. Without a word, she reached for the mending kit and began to stitch the fraying seams. Caleb watched her work, her fingers moving deftly despite her advanced pregnancy. "You don't have to do that," he said softly. Clara Belle looked up, a small smile playing at her lips. "I want to," she replied. "It's the least I can do after all you've done for me." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the rhythmic sound of Clara Belle's needle. As she worked, Caleb found himself studying her face, noticing the worry lines that creased her forehead and the way her eyes sometimes darted to the window, as if expecting danger to materialize from the storm. Finally, as she tied off the last stitch, Clara Belle set the gloves aside and met Caleb's gaze. "I suppose," she said hesitantly, "that it's time I told you the whole truth." Caleb leaned forward, his expression open and free of judgment. "I'm listening," he said simply. Clara Belle took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "The man in Cheyenne," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's not my husband. He never was." As the fire popped and hissed in the stove, Clara Belle's story unfolded. She spoke of arriving in Cheyenne, young and alone, finding work in a hotel owned by a man who seemed kind at first. His son had taken an interest in her, showering her with attention and promises of marriage. "I was naive," she admitted, her cheeks flushing with shame. "I believed him when he said he loved me, but then—" Her voice trailed off, and Caleb found himself reaching across the table to gently cover her hand with his own. "It's all right," he said softly. "Take your time." Clara Belle nodded gratefully. "I overheard him talking to his father. They were in debt, deep debt, and they—" She swallowed hard. "They were planning to sell me as a bride to settle what they owed." Caleb's jaw clenched, his hand tightening slightly over hers. "That's not right," he said, his voice rough with anger. "You're not property to be traded." "No," Clara Belle agreed, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "I'm not. That's why I ran. But I knew I needed something to survive, some kind of security." She paused, meeting Caleb's gaze. "That's when I remembered the deed." She went on to explain how she had nursed a cavalry officer through a bout of pneumonia just weeks before. The man, grateful beyond words, had pressed the deed into her hands as payment, insisting she take it even when she protested. "It was the only thing of value I had," Clara Belle said. "So I took it and fled. I thought if I could just get far enough away, find somewhere safe to have my baby, everything would be all right." As her story came to an end, Clara Belle's shoulders sagged, as if a great weight had been lifted. Caleb sat back in his chair, processing everything he had heard. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the kitchen a different kind of storm was brewing, one of righteous anger and fierce protectiveness. "Clara Belle," Caleb said at last, his voice steady and sure. "I want you to listen to me carefully. What that man and his father tried to do, it's not just wrong, it's criminal. You did the right thing by running." He stood up, moving to kneel beside her chair, his eyes level with hers. "I promise you this. As long as I have breath in my body, no one is going to take you anywhere you don't want to go. Not that man from Cheyenne, not the sheriff, not anyone. You and your baby are safe here." Tears welled up in Clara Belle's eyes, spilling over as she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." Caleb shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "There's no debt between us," he said softly. "We take care of our own out here, and like it or not, you're one of us now." As the blizzard raged on outside, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove spread through the kitchen. Clara Belle's revelation had changed something between them, deepening a connection that had been growing since that stormy night when she first appeared on Caleb's doorstep. The truth was out now, and with it came a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, be it the storm, the man from Cheyenne, or the uncertainties of Clara Belle's future. They would face them together. As the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, the blizzard's fury finally subsided. Caleb Merritt stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The world before him was a dazzling expanse of white, pristine and untouched under a crystal-clear sky. The air was crisp and still, a stark contrast to the howling winds that had battered the ranch for days. Inside, Clara Belle joined him at the door, her eyes widening at the transformed landscape. "It's beautiful," she breathed, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Caleb nodded, but his expression remained serious. "Aye, it is. But with clear skies comes trouble, I reckon." As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached their ears. A lone rider was approaching, cutting a dark path through the snow-covered plain. Caleb's hand instinctively moved to Clara Belle's arm, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed. The rider came into focus, Sheriff Lomax, his badge glinting in the morning sun. He reined in his horse at the fence, tipping his hat to Clara Belle before addressing Caleb. "Merritt," he called out, his breath visible in the cold air. "Got word from down south. That claimant and his party are only a day out. Thought you ought to know." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he nodded his thanks. "Much obliged, Sheriff." As Lomax rode away, Caleb turned to Clara Belle. Her face had paled, but there was a determined set to her chin. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. "We fight," Caleb replied, his voice low and steady. "But first we need to get some folks on our side. Time to go to town." Within the hour, Caleb had hitched up the sleigh. The snow was too deep for the wagon, but the runners cut smoothly through the drifts. Clara Belle sat beside him, wrapped in every blanket they could spare, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. The ride into town was silent, both of them lost in thought. The streets were just beginning to show signs of life as people emerged to dig out their doorways and check on neighbors. Caleb guided the sleigh straight to the small church at the end of Main Street. Reverend Parsons was outside, shoveling snow from the chapel steps. He looked up as they approached, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "Caleb, Miss Clara Belle," he greeted them, leaning on his shovel. "What brings you out in this?" Caleb helped Clara Belle down from the sleigh before turning to the preacher. "Reverend, we need your help. That man from Cheyenne's coming, and we need folks who can speak for Clara Belle's character." The Reverend's eyes softened as he looked at Clara Belle. "Of course," he said without hesitation. "I'd be happy to testify to the goodness I've seen in you, my dear. And I'm sure others in the congregation would do the same." Relief washed over Clara Belle's face. "Thank you, Reverend. You don't know what this means to me." They spent the rest of the day seeking out others who might speak on Clara Belle's behalf. The shopkeeper's wife who had admired her mending, the livery owner who had seen her gentleness with horses. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snowy streets, they had a small but solid group of supporters. As darkness fell, Caleb guided the sleigh to Martha's ranch house on the outskirts of town. His sister was waiting for them, concern etched on her face. "I heard the news," she said as she ushered them inside. "You'll stay here tonight. It's safer than being out at the ranch if that man shows up early." Over a simple supper of cornbread and beans, they discussed their plans for the next day. Martha's quiet strength was a balm to Clara Belle's nerves, and even Caleb found himself relaxing slightly in the warmth of his sister's kitchen. As the evening wore on, Martha excused herself to prepare the spare room, leaving Caleb and Clara Belle alone by the fire. The lamplight cast a soft glow over the room, softening the worry lines on both their faces. Caleb cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "Clara Belle," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I need you to know something." She turned to him, her eyes questioning. "What is it, Caleb?" He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "No matter what happens tomorrow, no matter what that deed says or what that man claims, I want you to stay. Here. With me." Clara Belle's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. "Caleb, I know it's sudden," he rushed on. And I know we've only known each other a short while, but these past weeks having you here, it's like the ranch has come alive again. Like I've come alive again." Tears welled up in Clarabelle's eyes, but she didn't look away. Slowly, she reached out and took Caleb's hand in hers. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered. "I can't tell you how much that means to me." For a moment, hope blazed in Caleb's eyes, but then Clarabelle squeezed his hand gently, her expression turning serious. "But we can't think about that now," she said softly. "Tomorrow we have to face what's coming. We have to stand together and fight for the truth. Only then can we dream of anything more." Caleb nodded, understanding and respect clear in his gaze. "You're right," he agreed. "We'll face it together, come what may." As they sat there, hands clasped in the warm lamplight, the future stretched out before them, uncertain, frightening, but also filled with possibility. Whatever the next day might bring, they would meet it side by side, their bond forged in the crucible of winter's fury and the warmth of newfound trust. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered streets of the small Wyoming town as a group of riders approached. At their head was a well-dressed man with a pinched expression, flanked by two rough-looking hired hands. The clatter of hooves on the packed snow drew curious onlookers from shops and houses. Sheriff Lomax stood outside his office, arms crossed as the party dismounted. "Mr. Hollister, I presume?" he asked, his voice neutral. The well-dressed man nodded curtly. "Indeed, I've come to claim what's rightfully mine." Inside the sheriff's office, Caleb Merritt and Clarabelle Hodge waited anxiously. Clarabelle's hands trembled slightly, but her chin was held high. Caleb placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as the door swung open. Mr. Hollister strode in, followed by his men and the sheriff. Without a word, he produced a thick packet of papers from his coat and slapped them down on the desk. "Here," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "is proof of my claim. A contract of intent to marry, signed by Miss Hodge herself, and a statement asserting my ownership of the land through her." Sheriff Lomax picked up the papers, studying them with a furrowed brow. Clarabelle's face had gone pale, but she spoke up clearly. "That contract was signed under false pretenses," she said. "You never intended to marry me. You only wanted to sell me off to settle your debts." Hollister's face twisted with anger. "You ungrateful!" "That's enough," Sheriff Lomax cut in. "This isn't something I can settle here and now. We'll need to hear both sides properly." Word spread quickly through the town. By midday, a crowd had gathered at the church hall. Reverend Parsons stood at the front, his calm presence a balm to the tension in the air. Martha Merritt sat in the front row, her steady gaze fixed on her brother and Clarabelle. As townsfolk filed in, filling the wooden pews, murmurs of speculation rippled through the crowd. Many had come to know Clarabelle over the past weeks, had seen her gentle nature and willingness to help. Others were simply curious about the drama unfolding in their usually quiet town. Sheriff Lomax called for order, his voice cutting through the chatter. "We're here to hear both sides of this dispute," he announced. "Mr. Hollister has presented papers claiming ownership of both Miss Hodge and a parcel of land. Miss Hodge contests this claim. We'll hear from both parties." Hollister stood first, his polished boots clicking on the wooden floor as he faced the crowd. "Good people of this town," he began, his voice smooth as oil. "I come before you as a wronged man. This woman," he pointed accusingly at Clarabelle, "agreed to be my wife. She signed a contract. Then she fled in the night, stealing a valuable piece of property, land that is rightfully mine through our agreement." A low murmur ran through the crowd. Hollister produced the papers again, waving them for all to see. "I have proof here. She's nothing but a thief and a liar." As he sat down, looking smugly satisfied, Clarabelle slowly rose to her feet. Her face was pale, but her voice rang out clear and strong. "I won't deny that I signed that paper," she began, "but I did so believing in a false promise of marriage and a better life. Mr. Hollister never intended to wed me. He planned to sell me as a bride to cover his gambling debts." Gasps and angry mutters rippled through the hall. Clarabelle took a deep breath and continued. "I fled because I feared for my life and the life of my unborn child. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. And then, by God's grace, I found shelter with a dying cavalry officer. Her voice softened as she recounted those difficult days. I nursed him through his last hours of pneumonia, and in gratitude he gave me the deed to 40 acres of land. He said it was all he had to offer, that it might give me and my baby a chance at a new life. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she blinked them back. I didn't steal that land. It was a gift, freely given, and I intend to use it to build a home and a future for my child. As Clara Bell sat down, the hall erupted in chatter. Many voices rose in support of her, expressing outrage at Hollister's actions. Reverend Parsons stepped forward, raising his hands for quiet. "I've known Miss Hodge only a short while," he said, his deep voice carrying easily through the hall. "But in that time, I've seen nothing but goodness and honesty in her. She's worked hard, helped her neighbors, and shown true Christian charity." Others stood to speak as well. The shopkeeper's wife praised Clara Bell's skill with a needle. The livery owner spoke of her gentleness with horses. Even gruff old widow Jensen had a kind word about the young woman who had helped her carry groceries without being asked. As the testimonies continued, Hollister's face grew increasingly red with anger. He jumped to his feet, shouting, "This is ridiculous! Are you all going to be fooled by some sob story? She's my property, and I demand—" "She ain't property," a voice called from the back of the hall. It was Caleb, standing tall, his eyes blazing. "She's a person, with her own mind and her own rights, and if you think you can come here and treat her like chattel, you've got another think coming." A chorus of agreement rose from the crowd. Sheriff Lomax had to shout to be heard over the din. All right. Settle down, everyone. It's clear there's more to this than just some legal papers. Mr. Hollister, I'm afraid I can't enforce your claim based on what we've heard here today." Hollister spluttered in disbelief. "But the contract appears to have been made under false pretenses," the sheriff finished firmly. "As for the land, well, that's a matter for the territorial court to decide. But for now, Miss Hodge stays right where she is." A cheer went up from the townsfolk. Clara Bell sagged with relief, and Martha was there in an instant, wrapping her in a warm embrace. Caleb made his way through the crowd, his eyes never leaving Clara Bell's face. As the hall began to clear, Hollister and his men slunk out, muttering darkly about appeals and higher courts. But for now, at least, Clara Bell was safe. She had faced her accuser, spoken her truth, and found a community ready to stand behind her. The future was still uncertain, the issue of the land not fully resolved. But as Clara Bell looked around at the smiling faces of her new neighbors, at Martha's supportive presence, and at Caleb's unwavering gaze, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. The tension in the church hall crackled like static before a storm. Clara Bell stood tall, her hands clasped protectively over her swollen belly, while Caleb hovered nearby, his jaw set in a hard line. The claimant, Mr. Hollister, paced back and forth, his polished boots clicking against the wooden floor. "This is preposterous," Hollister spat, his face flushed with anger. "You can't possibly believe the word of some vagrant over a respectable businessman." Sheriff Lomax held up a hand, trying to maintain order. "Now, Mr. Hollister, we're here to hear all sides." But Hollister was beyond reason. His eyes darted around the room, seeking an ally and finding none. Then his gaze landed on Caleb, and a cruel smile twisted his lips. "I see how it is," he sneered. "The girl's found herself a new protector, has she? Tell me, Merritt, does she know about your savage wife? Or does she not mind falling in with such undesirable company?" A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Caleb's face went white, then red with fury. His fists clenched at his sides as he took a menacing step forward. "You watch your mouth," Caleb growled, his voice low and dangerous. Hollister's smile widened, sensing he'd struck a nerve. "Hit a sore spot, did I? I suppose even savages can be missed when they're gone. Though I can't imagine why." He never finished the sentence. Caleb lunged forward, his right fist drawn back and ready to strike. Women shrieked, men shouted, and for a moment, chaos reigned. But before Caleb could land the blow, a firm hand gripped his shoulder. "That's enough!" Reverend Parsons' voice boomed through the hall, silencing the uproar. "We are gathered here in God's house to seek truth and justice, not to brawl like common thugs." The preacher's stern gaze swept the room, settling first on Caleb, then on Hollister. "Mr. Merritt, I understand your anger, but violence solves nothing. And you, sir," he addressed Hollister, "your words are unworthy of a Christian man. I suggest you hold your tongue lest you further reveal the darkness in your heart." Chastened, Caleb stepped back, though his eyes still burned with righteous anger. Hollister tugged at his collar, suddenly looking less sure of himself. Reverend Parsons turned to the assembly. "Now, let us proceed as civilized folk. We have witnesses who wish to speak to Miss Hodges' character. Let them be heard." One by one, townsfolk stood to testify. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, spoke of Clara Bell's kindness in helping with the church bake sale. Old Tom from the livery praised her gentle way with horses. Even gruff Widow Jensen had a good word, recounting how Clara Bell had helped her carry groceries without being asked. As the testimonies continued, Clara Bell's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She'd never imagined finding such support in this small town. When the last witness had spoken, Sheriff Lomax cleared his throat. "Well, it seems Miss Hodge has made quite an impression in her short time here. Now, about this deed." He held up the worn paper, studying it closely. "It appears genuine, but I'm afraid it won't be truly secure until it's properly recorded at the land office." A murmur of concern rippled through the crowd. Clara Bell's face fell, and Caleb stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Hollister seized on this opening. "Ha! You see? The land isn't even legally hers. I demand she be taken into custody until the authorities in Cheyenne can sort this matter out properly." The hall erupted in protest. Voices shouted over one another, some defending Clara Bell, others calling for order. Sheriff Lomax raised his hands, trying to quiet the crowd. "Now hold on just a minute," he began, but his words were lost in the din. Reverend Parsons stepped forward once more, his presence commanding attention. "Friends, neighbors, please, let us not forget the Christian virtues of mercy and compassion. This young woman is with child, in need of shelter and care. Would we truly cast her out into the cold?" His words seemed to calm the tumult, if only slightly. People turned to their neighbors, murmuring in hushed tones. Clara Bell, sensing her chance, spoke up. Her voice trembled but grew stronger with each word. "I know I'm a stranger here, and I know my story might seem hard to believe, but I swear on all that's holy, I've told you nothing but the truth. That land was given to me freely, a gift from a dying man. I only want a chance to make a home for my child, to build a life of honesty and hard work." Her simple, heartfelt plea seemed to touch even the most skeptical hearts. Heads nodded in sympathy, and more than a few eyes glistened with tears. Hollister, seeing the tide turning against him, made one last desperate attempt. "This is ridiculous. You can't possibly—" But his protests were drowned out by a growing chorus of support for Clara Bell. The tension in the room had shifted, the anger now directed at the man who would separate a mother-to-be from her only chance at security. Sheriff Lomax raised his voice to be heard over the clamor. All right. It's clear we won't resolve this today. Mr. Hollister, I'm afraid I can't honor your request to take Miss Hodge into custody. As for the land, well, that'll have to be sorted out proper-like through legal channels." Hollister's face twisted in fury, but he was smart enough to see he was outnumbered. With a final glare at Clara Bell and Caleb, he stormed out of the hall, his lackeys trailing behind him. As the door slammed shut, a collective sigh of relief swept through the room. The immediate danger had passed, but everyone knew this was far from over. The deed still needed to be recorded, and Hollister wasn't likely to give up his claim without a fight. Clara Bell sagged against Caleb, the stress of the confrontation finally catching up with her. He supported her gently, his touch a promise of protection. Around them, townspeople gathered, offering words of encouragement and support. The future remained uncertain, but for now at least, Clara Bell had found a community willing to stand beside her. As she looked up at Caleb, seeing the determination in his eyes, she felt a flicker of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't have to face them alone. The church hall slowly emptied as townsfolk filed out into the crisp winter air. Reverend Parsons stood at the center, his brow furrowed in thought. After a moment, he raised his hand, calling for attention. "Friends, I believe I have a solution that might satisfy all parties," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Miss Hodge will remain here in town, under the care and watch of our community, until this land matter can be properly settled." Clara Bell's shoulders sagged with relief while Mr. Hollister's face darkened with frustration. "She'll stay with my sister Martha," Caleb added quickly, his hand still resting protectively on Clara Bell's shoulder. Reverend Parsons nodded. "An excellent suggestion. Martha's reputation is beyond reproach, and her home will provide a safe haven for Miss Hodge and her unborn child." Hollister opened his mouth to protest, but the Reverend held up a hand. "Mr. Hollister, this compromise allows you time to wire Cheyenne for any additional documentation you believe will support your claim. It's a fair arrangement for all involved." The businessman's jaw worked silently for a moment before he grudgingly nodded. "Fine. But I want it known that I protest this coddling of a woman who's clearly trying to swindle me." "Your objection is noted," Sheriff Lomax said dryly. "Now I suggest we all get on home before this weather turns nasty again." As the group dispersed, Caleb guided Clara Bell towards his wagon. "Don't you worry," he murmured. "We'll get this sorted out." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Caleb hitched up his team early, determination etched on his weathered face. He helped Clara Bell into the wagon, tucking a warm blanket around her before climbing up himself. "Where are we going?" she asked, her breath visible in the frosty air. "Telegraph office," Caleb replied, clucking to the horses. "We're gonna send word to the territorial recorder ourselves. No sense in waiting for Hollister to make his move." The ride into town was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. At the telegraph office, Caleb helped Clara Bell down, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. Inside, the telegrapher greeted them with a smile. "What can I do for you folks today?" Clara Bell stepped forward, her voice steady. "I need to send a message to the territorial land recorder in Cheyenne. It's about a deed that needs to be properly filed." As Clara Bell dictated her message, Caleb watched her with admiration. Despite everything she'd been through, she stood tall, her words clear and purposeful. When the telegram was sent, he felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things would work out. They made the same trip the following day, checking for a response. Though no word had come yet, the routine of it, the quiet ride together, the shared purpose, began to feel comforting. Each evening they returned to Martha's home, where the kitchen glowed with warmth and savory scents filled the air. Martha had a gift for keeping spirits high, even in uncertain times. She bustled about, ladling out hearty stews and baking fresh bread that seemed to melt troubles away with each bite. "You two look done in," she said on the second night, ushering them to the table. "Sit down and get some of this rabbit stew in you. It'll put the roses back in your cheeks." As they ate, Martha regaled them with town gossip and funny stories from her schoolhouse. Clara Bell found herself laughing for the first time in days, the weight on her shoulders lifting, if only for a little while. After supper, Caleb excused himself, saying he needed to check on something in the barn. Clara Bell watched him go, a question in her eyes. "Don't you fret," Martha said with a knowing smile. "My brother's always been a man of few words, but his actions speak volumes." A short while later, Caleb returned, something large covered with a blanket in his arms. He set it down carefully in front of Clara Bell. I made this," he said gruffly, pulling the blanket away to reveal a beautifully crafted wooden cradle. Clara Bell gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The cradle was simple but elegant, its lines smooth and graceful. She reached out, running her fingers over the polished wood, feeling every curve and join that spoke of Caleb's careful work. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes, "it's beautiful." Caleb shuffled his feet, a hint of color rising in his cheeks. "Well, I figured the little one would need a place to sleep, and—" He trailed off, unable to find the right words. But Clara Bell understood. This wasn't just a cradle. It was a promise, a commitment to her and to the child she carried. In that moment, she saw a future she'd scarcely dared to hope for. Martha watched the scene unfold, her own eyes misty. "Well," she said briskly, wiping her hands on her apron, "I think this calls for some of that apple pie I've been saving." As Martha bustled off to the pantry, Caleb and Clara Belle shared a look of understanding. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The cradle between them stood as a symbol of hope, of family, of a love that was growing as steady and strong as the Wyoming pines. The morning sun struggled to break through the heavy clouds as Caleb hitched up the wagon. Clara Belle emerged from Martha's house, wrapped in a thick shawl against the biting wind. Her face was a mixture of hope and anxiety as she climbed up beside Caleb. "Another day, another trip to town," she said, attempting a smile. Caleb nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "We'll keep at it until we get word. Don't you worry." The ride into town was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the telegraph office, they saw a small crowd gathered outside. Martha was there, waving excitedly. "Caleb, Clara Belle," she called out, "a letter's come from Cheyenne." Caleb brought the wagon to a halt, helping Clara Belle down with gentle hands. They hurried over to where Reverend Parsons stood holding an official-looking envelope. "It arrived just this morning," the Reverend said, his eyes twinkling. "I thought it best to wait for you before opening it." With trembling fingers, Clara Belle took the letter. She broke the seal and unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the contents. Suddenly, she let out a small gasp. "What is it?" Caleb asked, unable to keep the concern from his voice. Clara Belle looked up, her eyes shining. They say the deed can be recorded, but we need sworn witness signatures to accompany it." A murmur of excitement rippled through the small crowd. Reverend Parsons stepped forward, a smile spreading across his face. "Well now, that's something we can certainly provide, can't we, folks?" Martha nodded enthusiastically. "Of course. I'll sign right this minute if you'd like." Two men from the crowd, Mr. Johnson the blacksmith and old Mr. Peterson from the general store, also stepped forward. "We'd be happy to sign as well," Mr. Johnson said, his deep voice rumbling with sincerity. "We've all seen how you've conducted yourself since coming to town, Miss Hodge. It would be our honor to help." Tears welled up in Clara Belle's eyes. I don't know what to say. Thank you all so much." Reverend Parsons ushered them into the telegraph office where they could use the desk to sign the necessary papers. One by one, they affixed their signatures to the document, each stroke of the pen bringing Clara Belle closer to security. As they finished, the door to the office burst open. Mr. Hollister stormed in, his face red with anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "What are you all signing?" Sheriff Lomax, who had been quietly observing from the corner, stepped forward. "Now, Mr. Hollister, there's no need for that tone. These good folks are simply providing witness signatures for Miss Hodge's land deed." Hollister's face fell as he realized the implications. He looked from face to face, seeing only determination and support for Clara Belle. His shoulders sagged as the fight seemed to drain out of him. "It's over then?" he asked, his voice suddenly small. Caleb nodded, standing protectively close to Clara Belle. "It is. The deed will be recorded in her name. There's nothing more for you here." Hollister was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working. Then, in a last desperate attempt, he turned to Clara Belle. "Listen, surely we can come to some arrangement," he wheedled. "I'll pay you a fair price for the land. More than fair. Just name your figure, and I'll be on my way." Clara Belle straightened her spine, looking Hollister directly in the eye. "Mr. Hollister, this land isn't just a piece of property to me. It's my future, and my child's future. It's not for sale at any price." A hush fell over the room at her words. Caleb felt a surge of pride, seeing the strength and determination in the woman beside him. Sheriff Lomax cleared his throat. "Well, I believe that settles the matter. Mr. Hollister, I think it's best if you make arrangements to leave town. By sundown, if you please." Hollister's face twisted in frustration, but he could see he was beaten. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the office. As the door slammed behind him, Clarabelle let out a long, shaky breath. She turned to Caleb, her eyes brimming with emotion, and clasped his arm. "It's over," she whispered. "It's really over." Caleb covered her hand with his own, a smile breaking across his weathered face. "Yes, it is. You're safe now, Clarabelle. You and the little one both." The others in the room broke into soft applause and congratulations. Martha rushed forward to envelop Clarabelle in a warm hug, while Reverend Parsons shook Caleb's hand heartily. "This calls for a celebration," Martha declared. "I've got a nice ham at home that'll feed us all. What do you say we have a proper supper tonight?" As the group filed out of the telegraph office making plans for the evening's festivities, Caleb and Clarabelle lingered behind for a moment. They stood close, neither speaking, simply basking in the relief and joy of the moment. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly. Clarabelle looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready to go home." Hand in hand, they stepped out into the crisp winter air, towards a future that was suddenly bright with promise. As the golden light of late afternoon streamed through the windows of Martha's cozy kitchen, Caleb and Clarabelle sat at the worn wooden table, steaming mugs of coffee warming their hands. The room still held the lingering scent of celebratory apple pie, a treat Martha had insisted on baking to mark the end of their ordeal. Caleb cleared his throat, his eyes meeting Clarabelle's with a mixture of nervousness and hope. "Clarabelle," he began, his voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking about the land and, well, about us." Clarabelle's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "That deed you've got, it's 40 acres of prime grazing land," Caleb went on. "It's more than enough to give you and the little one a fresh start. But I was wondering—" He paused, taking a deep breath. "I'd like to offer to buy half of it from you." Clarabelle's eyes widened in surprise. "Buy half? But Caleb," I thought. He held up a hand, a gentle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Now, don't misunderstand. This isn't about business. It's about, well, it's about us working it together, side by side, building something that'll last." Understanding dawned in Clarabelle's eyes and a warm smile spread across her face. She reached across the table, placing her hand over Caleb's. "Oh, Caleb," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "That's a mighty fine offer, but I've got a counter-proposal for you." Caleb's brow furrowed slightly. "Oh?" Clarabelle's smile grew wider. "How about we work all of it together? Side by side, just like you said. No buying, no selling, just sharing, building that future together on all 40 acres. The worry lines on Caleb's face melted away, replaced by a look of pure joy. He turned his hand over, clasping Clarabelle's tightly. "I reckon that sounds just about perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape, the church bell rang out, calling the townsfolk to gather. The dispute over Clarabelle's land had been settled just in time for a belated New Year's celebration, and the entire town seemed eager to come together after the tense days they'd all weathered. Caleb offered Clarabelle his arm as they made their way down the path to the church, their boots crunching in the crisp snow. Martha walked a few paces ahead, carrying a basket laden with her famous honey biscuits. The church was warm and inviting, lit by dozens of candles that cast a soft glow over the gathered faces. Reverend Parsons stood at the front, a broad smile on his face as he welcomed everyone. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room, "we've come together not just to welcome a new year, but to celebrate new beginnings and the strength of our community." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Clarabelle felt Caleb's hand tighten around hers, and she leaned into him slightly, drawing comfort from his solid presence. As the evening wore on, filled with laughter, shared food, and heartfelt conversations, Reverend Parsons called for some music. "Clarabelle," he said, his eyes twinkling, "I believe we all remember your beautiful voice from last Sunday. Would you grace us with another song?" Clarabelle hesitated for just a moment before nodding. As she made her way to the front of the church, she felt Caleb's encouraging gaze following her. Taking a deep breath, Clarabelle began to sing Amazing Grace, her clear, sweet voice filling the church. As she reached the chorus, something unexpected happened. Caleb's deep baritone joined in, blending perfectly with her melody. Clarabelle's eyes sought him out, and she saw him standing near the back, a slight blush on his cheeks but his voice strong and sure. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, it felt as if they were the only two people in the room, their voices intertwining like a promise of the future they would build together. As the final notes faded away, the church erupted in applause. Clarabelle made her way back to Caleb's side, her cheeks flushed with happiness. "I didn't know you could sing," she whispered. Caleb shrugged, a shy smile on his face. "Reckon there's still a few things for us to learn about each other," he said softly. As the celebration continued around them, Caleb and Clarabelle stood close, their hands joined, their hearts full of hope for the life they would create together on those 40 acres of Wyoming land. The new year had begun with challenges, but it stretched before them now, full of promise and shared dreams. Spring arrived slowly in the high country, its gentle touch gradually thawing the frozen landscape. The snow-capped peaks that had stood sentinel through the long winter began to shed their white mantles, feeding the swollen rivers below. Along the 40 acres that Clarabelle and Caleb now shared, the river rushed and gurgled, its banks overflowing with the promise of new life. In Martha's cozy kitchen, warmed by the glow of oil lamps, Clarabelle sat in a well-worn rocking chair, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. Her newborn son, barely a week old, slept peacefully in her arms, his tiny fingers curled around one of hers. The room was filled with the rich aroma of fresh coffee as Caleb moved about, preparing a pot for their expected visitors. "He's got your eyes," Clarabelle said softly, gazing down at the infant's face. Caleb paused in his task, a tender smile spreading across his weathered features. "And your nose, I reckon," he replied, his voice warm with affection. As if on cue, a gentle knock sounded at the door. Martha, who had been arranging flowers on the table, hurried to answer it. Soon the kitchen was filled with the cheerful voices of townsfolk, each bearing gifts to welcome the newest member of their community. Mrs. Peterson, the shopkeeper's wife, presented a beautifully knitted blanket, its soft wool dyed in shades of blue and green. "For when he's a bit bigger," she said with a wink, draping it over the back of Clarabelle's chair. Old Tom, the grizzled farmer from down the road, set a crate of carefully packed jars on the table. "Sarah's best preserves," he announced proudly, referring to his late wife. "Peaches, strawberries, and that blackberry jam she was so famous for." The door creaked open once more, and two of Caleb's ranch hands struggled in with a sturdy rocking chair, its wood polished to a soft sheen. "From all of us at the ranch," one of them said, tipping his hat to Clarabelle. "Figured you might need a bigger chair for when the little fella starts growing." Caleb's eyes glistened as he helped position the chair near the fireplace. "Much obliged," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "To all of you." As the kitchen filled with well-wishers, Reverend Parsons arrived, his Bible tucked under one arm. The room quieted as he approached Clarabelle and the baby, a gentle smile on his face. "May I?" he asked, holding out his arms. Clarabelle nodded, carefully transferring her precious bundle to the Reverend's waiting embrace. The old preacher cradled the child with practiced ease, looking down at the tiny face with a mixture of joy and reverence. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room, "we've gathered here today to welcome this new life into our community. In times past, we've faced challenges together, and now, we come together in celebration." He placed a weathered hand on the baby's forehead. "Lord, we ask your blessing on this child. May he grow strong and true, guided by the love of his parents and the support of this community. May he know your grace all the days of his life. Amen." A chorus of amens echoed through the kitchen. As the Reverend handed the baby back to Clarabelle, Caleb moved to stand beside her chair. He wrapped one arm around her shoulders, his other hand resting gently on his son's blanket-wrapped form. Together, they gazed at the wooden cradle near the fire, the one Caleb had carved with his own hands during those long winter nights of waiting and hoping. The firelight danced across the smooth curves of the cradle, casting flickering shadows on the wall. In that moment, as night settled over the ranch outside, the kitchen was filled with a warmth that went beyond the crackling fire. It was the warmth of community, of shared joy, and of a love that had grown strong through adversity. Clara Belle looked up at Caleb, her eyes shining. "You know," she said softly, so that only he could hear, "when I first came to your door that snowy night, I thought I had something to offer as a reward. But now I see." Caleb nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The only reward worth having," he finished for her, "is love freely given." As they stood there, surrounded by friends and well-wishers, with their newborn son cradled between them, both Caleb and Clara Belle knew that they had found something far more precious than land or legal claims. They had found a home, a family, and a love that would sustain them through whatever challenges the future might bring. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.